as far as what I think would have happened, I agreed with your first round of the playoffs there with San Francisco coming into Green Bay and losing. You're right, they weren't a good team that year. I think that would have been a pretty easy victory, and I don't know what was going on with the Packers the last week of the season against the Jets and against Atlanta, but just so uninspired and just didn't show up. You would think that eventually, now that it's the divisional round of the playoffs, hopefully they could show up for that, but who knows? And maybe they overlook San Francisco too and not even making it past that. But yeah, Philly, Tampa Bay would have been a fantastic game, but I think Tampa would have won that. And here's where our differences are, is because I think there's absolutely no way they beat Tampa Bay in the championship game. I mean, I can see it happening. I mean, not saying that they wouldn't have had any shot, but that Tampa Bay defense was so good, and I know their offense wasn't great, but I just don't see any way. If we only put up 7 points against Atlanta and their defense was, nothing fantastic at all, I don't know really anybody from who was on that defense at the time. I don't know if you do.
Patrick Kearney, wasn't he there? And Ray Buchanan, was he still there?
Yeah, he might have
been on the Raiders, actually, when the Raiders signed every guy who was awesome in 1991 that year.
Yeah, but I really don't see any way to me, the 2002 Green Bay Packers were just not good enough. There's a chance they beat Tampa Bay. There's a chance they beat San Francisco. There's a chance they beat Oakland in the Super Bowl. But they're just not good enough to me. They're so inconsistent. How does a team that can't show up against, the Jets with everything on the line, you have a chance to get a 1 seed in the playoffs, and you can't beat the New York Jets?
Well, I think that's one thing that I maybe differ a little bit is you have to remember that we're assuming that never happened, and I know it's hard to unremember that.
Yeah, I suppose.
I think the reason, and I'm there with you, because it's a bit of a leap for me to say they could have beat Tampa, but the reason I say they could have beaten Tampa is the Packers were a more balanced team than Tampa was. Tampa's defense was an all-time great defense that year, 12 points a game. I think they might have allowed fewer points than the 85 Bears that year. And if they hadn't, it was close. I know the Bears had 12 and change allowed points in 85, and then Tampa's points allowed were 12 and change. But when they played that year, the Chad Clifton injury game, I looked back on the stats, and of course that was one of the Brett Favre Raymond James Stadium specials with the 4 interceptions. They lost 21-7. But the statistics other than the 4 turnovers, I'm looking at it right now. The total yards was 267 for Green Bay, 246 for Tampa. They had 15 first downs for the Packers, 14 for Tampa. The 3 sacks against the Packers, 2 against Tampa Bay. Penalties were 6 and 7. Other than Brett Favre throwing 4 interceptions, they were almost identical. And I think at Green Bay, I know it's hard now because he had so many meltdowns, but in 2002, Favre didn't throw interceptions like that at home. He'd throw them in the Metrodome. He'd throw them at Raymond James Stadium. He'd throw them at Texas Stadium. But at 33 that he was then, he still wasn't throwing interceptions like that at home. Maybe this would have been the first game, and instead of having the Atlanta memory, we'd have this memory. I think they could have beaten Tampa. I think it's almost a harder argument to say maybe they don't beat the Raiders than it is to beat Tampa. But both of those teams aren't all-time great teams, but they were definitely better than anybody else in the league that year. So it's tough to say the Packers could beat both of them, but I think they could. Especially Brett Favre, if he's gotten that far, he was still in the realm where he would just get hot and go on a tear, where that slowly diminished towards the end of his career until he revived it in Minnesota. But I think they could have beaten the Tampa Bay Bucks. I guess, what do you think? Do you think it's pretty much unchanged then if they lose to Tampa as far as the history of the team?
Yeah, so if I'm saying they lose to Tampa, even if they beat Tampa, they might go to the Super Bowl, and I don't think they win that either. Like I said, there's a chance that they beat both those teams. I just don't think they're good enough to get through that whole gauntlet in the playoffs.
Okay.
But I guess that being the case, if they were to lose to Tampa there, I would have to say it's pretty much unchanged. The only thing that might differ a little bit is maybe Sherman would have had a little bit longer of a leash after the 05 season when he got canned, and if maybe he makes it to the NFC Championship game or the Super Bowl this season, maybe we're not so quick to get rid of him after, one bad season. Mm-hmm. So maybe he hangs out for another couple of years in Green Bay, and we probably wouldn't have gotten Mike McCarthy then. Mm-hmm. In that instance, everything changes. But with what I'm saying here is almost completely different from you, is where you say they win the Super Bowl and everything changes. I'm going to say they lose to Tampa in the NFC Championship game, still have the good run in 03, mediocre in 04, and a really bad season in 05, and Sherman's still let go. So I'm going to say maybe a few small things here and there, but I'm going to say basically nothing changes.
Okay. I guess one other thing I'd like to get your opinion on, having heard your opinion on this. What do you think as far as if Mike Sherman had won a Super Bowl? What do you think the state of the team would be now? And I guess how was your feeling about that? If you think it would be equal, if you think it would be worse? To me, it's kind of a wash. Like, I know it's fun to have a team that's in it right now, but as far as, like I said, 10, 15 years from now, a Super Bowl win in 2002 and a Super Bowl win in 2010, if those were flip-flopped, years from now, what's the difference, I guess is kind of what I'm asking. What is your opinion on that as far as if Sherman would have won a Super Bowl and maybe we weren't in as good a shape now, which would you prefer? Would you prefer if they won a Super Bowl in 2002 and see what happens, or just leave it alone?
I prefer to leave it alone. I think you look a little more fondly back on the Sherman era than I do. And maybe that's why I don't think the Packers could win the Super Bowl that year, just because my memories of that era and that coaching staff and the teams that we had with them just aren't that great, I guess. I like how things worked out. I like McCarthy better than Sherman. I mean, you just take a look back at their drafts, and Sherman had some really terrible drafts.
Mm-hmm.
If you prolong that, if he stays after '05, stays through '06, and maybe even still now, the drafts could have really impacted us, and maybe we aren't as talented as we are now. We probably don't have Aaron Rodgers.
Mm-hmm.
I like McCarthy's play calling better. And obviously, I think without a doubt, Ted Thompson's a better general manager than Sherman was.
Yeah, I can't argue with that.
So, I mean, I guess I prefer how things worked out. I mean, I don't want to be saying, oh, I'm so much more happy that we won it more recently than 2002. To me, that doesn't really matter.
Okay.
But again, I liked how things worked out here, and I like that we have McCarthy now. I like the situation we're in a lot better now than we were with Sherman. So I guess I would prefer that we had won it in 2010 instead of 2002.
Yeah, I guess that's the thing that I've felt like I've been fighting for years is Mike Sherman, I think, doesn't get enough credit for how good of a coach he was. They won 3 straight division titles with him. They were in 4 straight playoffs. I know they didn't do a whole lot in the playoffs, but Mike McCarthy, other than that 2010 run, hasn't done much in the playoffs either. I mean, he's got 2 one-and-dones. They haven't been as consistent as the Mike Sherman Packers have, and he's had better talent. That's, I guess, why I'm saying I don't know if it necessarily would have been worse. Let's say that your scenario happens and Ted Thompson still gets hired. I'm almost wondering what the team would be if they had Mike Sherman as the head coach and Ted Thompson as the general manager. Not that McCarthy is a great coach, and I think he's outstanding, but I'm not willing to say that he's that much better than Mike Sherman. Because look at that 2004 team. He got him a 3 seed with that team that was atrocious. I mean, defensively, that might be the worst team I've ever seen, including this year's team. And he got them to the playoffs. In 2003, he had guys rushing the passer like Arcal, Trueluck, and guys like that, and he got them to the playoffs. And I know that offense was good, but I just think that Mike Sherman did more with less and did almost as much as McCarthy has done, except with half the talent. That's why I guess I have more faith that it's possible that they could have won it in 2002.
All right. Well, just one last argument here with the 2004 team. You say that the Packers were terrible, like Sherman had nothing to do with it. I mean, I think he was probably a pretty large part of why they were so bad, and they made it as a 3 seed, but that division was awful, and they were beating up on some really bad Detroit Lions teams.
But they had to sweat out the Vikings till the end.
Yeah, but the Vikings weren't very good either, and they didn't end up doing anything in the playoffs after they beat us either.
It's hard to argue with that. I just think that the fact that he even got that team to the playoffs after all that stuff, and yeah, maybe they weren't very good, and remember that horrible game against the Eagles and that horrible start they had, but I don't know. I just think that he's a better coach than he gets credit for, and maybe that's me thinking with the rose-colored glasses looking back on something that was a decade ago now, but I talked about that in our first episode. With Mike McCarthy, I think he's a really good coach, but the fact that he's got a Super Bowl title from a 6 seed, very Giants-esque, wedged between 2 one-and-done defensive breakdowns, where his team looked like they didn't care on one side of the ball, or they weren't ready on the other side of the ball. I mean, look at the Arizona game, too. That offense played 2 quarters. They had a tremendous 2 quarters, but they didn't look ready to play in that game either. So I'm saying that maybe there's more similarities between McCarthy and Sherman that I care to admit, and I certainly hope that McCarthy is head and shoulders above him, but at this point in his career, I'm not ready to say that despite the Super Bowl championship.
And if only there was some way to see what Sherman would be doing with this current team, and how he'd be doing with maybe a different general manager drafting for him. But unfortunately we can't. And I guess personally I wouldn't trade how this has turned out to have kept Sherman around. But I definitely understand some of your points, and maybe McCarthy isn't head and shoulders above Sherman at this point yet. Hopefully in the future he can elevate himself a little bit up to that point. But I feel a lot more comfortable with him and Thompson at the helm than Sherman running the show, I guess, still.
Yeah, I can't really argue with that. I think as far as the 2012 season is concerned, we're better off where we are than if we had won in 2002.